Reddit's Nightmares. 5 creepypasta to make you sleep with the lights on. True scary stories. What if the scariest stories you've ever heard weren't just stories? Imagine the whispered fears that creep into your mind late at night, the tales that make your skin crawl, and the shadows that seem to move in the corner of your eye. What if these weren't merely figments of an overactive imagination? What if these were echoes of something much darker? Stories not born of fiction, but of fragments of reality bleeding into our world. This is the chilling allure of creepypasta, a genre of modern folklore that thrives in the vast and uncharted corners of the internet. Emerging from the digital void, these stories are the campfire tales of our age, shared not under the stars but through screens glowing in the dark. They are short, unnerving narratives crafted to unsettle, to linger in your mind long after you've read them, and to make you question what you thought was true. Among the many platforms that have embraced this eerie art form, Reddit stands as a beacon, or perhaps a warning sign, in the digital darkness. With its countless forums and a community eager to explore the unknown, Reddit has become a breeding ground for some of the most spine-chilling tales the internet has ever produced. Here, storytellers share their darkest imaginings, while others post experiences that seem too vivid, too personal, and too haunting to be entirely fabricated. Tonight, we're diving into the abyss of Reddit's most terrifying nightmares. 5 stories that will send shivers down your spine and make you question the safety of your own reality. These tales are more than just words on a screen. They are invitations to peer into the shadows where the boundaries between fact and fiction dissolve. Each one is a testament to the internet's ability to weave fear into the fabric of our lives, leaving us to wonder, is it really just a story? Prepare yourself for an unsettling journey as we explore tales of whispers in the walls, shadowy figures in mirrors, and towns that don't exist on any map. Each story promises to linger, to crawl into your mind and make itself at home, ensuring that when you finally turn out the lights, you'll think twice before closing your eyes. The shadows of Reddit are calling. Will you dare to step into the darkness? Story 1. The Whispering Walls. The story begins with a seemingly innocuous post on a Reddit thread dedicated to urban exploration. The user, who went by the username Lost_Fight, described an encounter that would haunt anyone brave enough to read it. The setting was a decrepit house on the outskirts of their small town, a place rumored to have been abandoned for decades. Drawn by a mix of curiosity and thrill-seeking, the Redditor decided to venture inside, unaware of the nightmare that awaited them. As they pushed the creaking door open, a wave of cold air swept over them. The air inside the house felt dense, almost suffocating, carrying with it a faint, musty scent of decay. Dust hung in the sunlight streaming through cracked windows, creating a stillness that felt unnatural. But what struck them most was the silence. It was too quiet, as if the house itself were holding its breath, waiting. The whispers began faintly at first, attributing it to the wind. Lost in the light pressed further into the house, their flashlight flickering against the peeling wallpaper and broken furniture. But then, as they stood in what seemed to be the living room, the whispers grew louder, more distinct. They described the sound as if multiple voices were speaking in hushed tones, overlapping in a language they couldn't quite decipher. And then it happened. The whispers called their name. Clear as day, a voice, neither male nor female, rose above the others and spoke. "Come closer, Alex." The Redditor froze, their heart pounding. They hadn't shared their name with anyone about this exploration. Panic surged through them as the whispers began repeating their name, each time with a more insistent, almost pleading tone. The post detailed their frantic escape, stumbling over broken furniture and slipping on debris as the whispers seemed to follow them. When they finally burst out of the house into the daylight, the voices stopped abruptly, leaving an eerie silence behind. But the experience had marked them, leaving them unable to shake the feeling of being watched, even in their own home. The Reddit thread exploded with comments, but one stood out among the rest. A user named Echoing Shadows wrote, "I've been there too. They whisper my name as well." This comment sent chills down everyone's spine, as it lent credibility to the story and deepened the mystery of the house. Several other users chimed in, claiming to have heard similar whispers when visiting other abandoned locations, as if these voices traveled, seeking new listeners. The story of Lost__for Light became a viral sensation, drawing comparisons to classic haunted house tropes. Experts in paranormal folklore noted that the story mirrored ancient legends of spirits trapped within walls, bound to their last place of suffering. The whispers, they speculated, could be echoes of past residents, trying to lure the living into their eternal prison. Psychologists chimed in, too, discussing the terror of feeling watched, a primal fear embedded deep within human consciousness. The idea that unseen entities could not only see us, but also know intimate details about our lives, like our names, is a violation of our sense of safety. It's this psychological element that makes stories like the Whispering Walls so universally chilling. As the legend of the house grew, urban explorers flocked to the location, hoping to experience the whispers themselves. Some claimed to hear faint murmurs, while others insisted the house was just an empty, decaying structure. But one thing was clear. The story had embedded itself in the collective fear of Reddit's community, leaving readers to wonder if they, too, might someday hear their names whispered in the dark. Story 2. The Vanishing Friend. The Redditor, posting under the username Trailblazer22, began their story with an ominous opening. I thought camping was supposed to be a way to reconnect with nature and your closest friends. I never expected it to become a nightmare I'd never wake from. They recounted a trip taken with their best friend, Eric, to a remote camping site deep in the wilderness. The area was renowned for its serene beauty, but had an unsettling reputation. There were whispers of people vanishing without a trace, their belongings left undisturbed. For Trailblazer 22, these stories were nothing more than exaggerated campfire tales designed to scare tourists. They couldn't have been more wrong. The trip began uneventfully. They set up camp near a crystal-clear lake surrounded by towering pines, their laughter and conversations echoing in the stillness. As night fell, they shared stories around a crackling fire, the warmth warding off the cool mountain air. Everything seemed perfect until Eric grew quiet, staring into the darkness beyond the firelight. When asked what was wrong, Eric muttered something strange. "Do you ever feel like you're being watched?" Before Trailblazer 22 could respond, Eric shook his head as if dismissing the thought and changed the subject. But the unease lingered, casting a shadow over the rest of the evening. The next morning, Trailblazer 22 awoke to an eerie silence. The fire had burned out and Eric was gone. At first, they assumed Eric had gone for a morning hike, but as the hours passed, worry began to set in. They searched the campsite and surrounding trails, calling Eric's name, but there was no response. Only the oppressive stillness of the wilderness. Then, they found the note. It was written on a scrap of paper torn from Eric's notebook, the words scrawled hastily and almost illegible. "Don't look for me. I am sorry. It's watching." Panic set in as Trailblazer 22 tried to make sense of the cryptic message. What was it? And why would Eric, who had always been level-headed and rational, write something so bizarre? They packed up and hiked back to civilization, notifying the authorities and recounting everything they knew. A search party was launched, but no trace of Eric was ever found. Not a footprint, not a piece of clothing, nothing. The post on Reddit quickly gained traction, drawing hundreds of comments. What made the story even more chilling were the replies from other users who claimed to have experienced similar disappearances in the same area. One user, Wilderness Watcher, recounted losing a sibling under nearly identical circumstances, right down to the cryptic note. Another user, Pine Ghost, described seeing shadowy figures moving between the trees when camping in the region, accompanied by an overwhelming sense of dread. The thread became a hub for theories. Some suggested a natural explanation. Perhaps Eric had fallen victim to an animal attack, though the lack of any evidence made this unlikely. Others speculated about supernatural forces, pointing to folklore about forest spirits or entities that lured people away from safety. The most unsettling theory came from Echo Explorer, who suggested that Eric's note indicated a predatory, sentient force, something intelligent enough to stalk its prey and insidious enough to drive it to despair. Psychologists chimed in on the discussion, exploring the impact of isolation and the fear of the unknown. They noted that prolonged exposure to the vast emptiness of nature can amplify paranoia and create a sense of being watched, even in the absence of any real threat. But even these rational explanations couldn't account for the recurring pattern of disappearances in the same area, or the cryptic warnings left behind. The story of Eric's disappearance haunted the Reddit community. Readers began sharing their own experiences of camping trips gone wrong, contributing to a growing archive of unsettling encounters in the wilderness. For Trailblazer 22, the experience left a scar that time could not heal. In their final post on the thread, they wrote, "Every time I close my eyes, I see Eric's face, hear his voice. I don't know what happened to him, but I know one thing for sure. Something out there is watching, and it's waiting." The vanishing friend remains a chilling reminder of the mysteries lurking in the great outdoors and the unknown forces that may be closer than we dare to imagine. Story 3. The Shadow in the Mirror. It began innocuously enough. The Redditor, posting under the username Reflected Reality, shared a seemingly simple question on the r/paranormal subreddit. Have you ever seen something in a mirror that wasn't you? The post, accompanied by a blurry photo of a bathroom mirror, sparked immediate intrigue. Within hours, it became one of the most upvoted posts of the week, and as Reflected Reality continued to share their story, it quickly spiraled into one of the most unsettling tales to emerge from Reddit. The story began a few weeks prior when Reflected Reality moved into a new apartment, a quaint but slightly run-down space in an older building. One of its quirks was the large antique mirror in the bathroom, framed with tarnished silver and etched with faint decorative swirls. It was a striking centerpiece, though its surface bore subtle imperfections, small scratches and a slight discoloration in the glass. At first, everything seemed normal. The mirror was just a mirror, a functional object in an otherwise ordinary bathroom. But late one night, while brushing their teeth, Reflected Reality noticed something odd. Their reflection didn't move quite in sync. It was subtle, a delay so slight that they initially dismissed it as a trick of the light or their own fatigue. But it happened again the next night, and the night after. The lag grew more pronounced. Reflected Reality described staring into the mirror, raising an arm or tilting their head, and watching their reflection respond a fraction of a second later. Sometimes, they swore it moved before they did. The breaking point came during a particularly late night when they returned home after a long shift at work. Exhausted but too wired to sleep, they stepped into the bathroom and flicked on the light. Their reflection was already waiting. It stood there, staring back at them before mimicking their movement to reach for the switch. Panicked, Reflected Reality backed out of the room, slamming the door shut. But when they mustered the courage to check again, the reflection was normal, or so it seemed. The figure in the mirror looked just like them, but something was off. Its eyes seemed darker, the expression just a shade too intense, as though it were studying them rather than mirroring them. After sharing this part of the story, Reflected Reality uploaded the blurry photo of the mirror, claiming it was taken in haste after the encounter. Though the image revealed no obvious anomalies, it only added to the tension of the post. Readers began sharing theories, many focusing on mirrors as portals. Some suggested the shadowy figure was a reflection of another dimension bleeding through, while others believed it to be a malevolent entity imitating them, waiting for an opportunity to step into their world. The thread exploded with engagement. Users shared their own experiences with strange reflections, unmoving figures, shadowy presences, or fleeting glimpses of something not quite right. A user named Glassgazer wrote, "There's an old superstition that mirrors are doorways to the soul. If something else is looking back at you, it might mean your soul is no longer alone." As the story continued, Reflected Reality described how the incidents escalated. They began to hear faint whispers when they stood near the mirror, indistinct words that seemed to be coming from inside the glass. Sometimes, they'd wake up to find the bathroom light on, even though they were sure they'd turned it off before bed. The climax came one night when they decided to confront the mirror head-on. Armed with a flashlight and a growing sense of dread, they approached the bathroom, their phone recording every step. Standing before the mirror, they stared into their own eyes and whispered, "Who are you?" For a moment, nothing happened. Then the reflection smiled. It wasn't a warm or friendly smile. It was sharp, predatory, and utterly alien. Reflected reality froze as the figure raised a hand and pressed it against the inside of the glass, leaving a faint imprint on the surface. Terrified, they fled the apartment that night, refusing to return until daylight. They moved out shortly after, abandoning the mirror and leaving behind their eeriest possession. The story's reach extended far beyond Reddit, making its way to creepypasta websites and YouTube horror channels. It tapped into a primal fear, one of seeing something unexplainable in a place we consider safe. Mirrors have long been a staple in horror lore, often depicted as gateways to other realms or tools of malevolent spirits. Reflected Reality's tale felt like a modern iteration of this timeless fear, amplified by the intimacy of their first-hand account. Though many debated the authenticity of the story, others argued that the emotional intensity behind the posts felt too raw to be fabricated. In their final update, Reflected Reality wrote, "I don't care if you believe me or not. I know what I saw. All I can say is this. If you ever feel like your reflection isn't quite right, don't stick around to find out why." To this day, The Shadow in the Mirror stands as one of Reddit's most iconic and chilling tales, a haunting reminder that sometimes the scariest monsters aren't hiding under the bed. They're staring back at us from the other side of the glass. Story 4. The Forgotten Town. It was supposed to be a shortcut. The Redditor, posting under the username Lost in Lights, shared their unnerving experience on our /NoSleep, claiming it began during a late-night road trip through a sparsely populated region of the Midwest. Running low on gas and weary from hours on the road, they decided to take an unfamiliar route marked by a hand-painted sign that read Barlow, 12 miles. A small detour, they thought, just enough to refuel and grab a quick meal before continuing their journey. The road to Barlow was unremarkable at first, a narrow stretch flanked by dense trees and occasional glimpses of farmland. But as they approached the supposed town, a peculiar sense of unease began to creep in. The first oddity was the lack of signs of life. No cars, no houses along the way, not even distant porch lights. Just an oppressive silence broken only by the crunch of gravel beneath their tires. When the town finally appeared, it seemed almost too perfect, like a movie set frozen in time. Neatly arranged houses lined the streets, their paint unblemished, their lawns immaculate. The main street featured a diner, a gas station, and a small general store, all with retro signage that looked decades out of place. The streetlights glowed a warm, steady yellow, illuminating an eerie emptiness. It took a moment for Lost in Lights to realize what was wrong. There were no people, no movement, no chatter, no hum of distant activity. But the town wasn't abandoned in the conventional sense. The gas station's pumps were intact, and the diner's neon open sign flickered faintly. Even stranger were the mannequins. In place of townsfolk, mannequins stood in various poses throughout the town, meticulously dressed and eerily lifelike. A woman in a polka dot dress stood in front of the diner, holding an empty coffee cup. A man in overalls leaned against a lamppost, a cigarette frozen in his plastic fingers. Children played on a swing set in a park nearby, their painted eyes fixed on the horizon. Hesitant but desperate for gas, Lost in Lights decided to pull up to the station. They described stepping out of the car as akin to walking into another world. The air felt heavier, the silence almost deafening. As they approached the pump, they noticed a mannequin behind the station's counter, dressed in a uniform and wearing a fixed, blank smile. Against their better judgment, they tried to operate the pump, only to find it functional despite the lack of any visible power source. As they refueled, the unsettling details multiplied. The mannequin's clothes were free of dust, their hair uncannily realistic. The diner's windows revealed tables set for meals, complete with steaming cups of coffee, as though the patrons had simply vanished mid-bite. And yet, there was no sign of decay, no indication of how long the town had been this way. Unable to shake the feeling of being watched, Lost in Lights hurriedly returned to their car and decided to drive through the town to find the highway on the other side. But the deeper they ventured, the stranger it became. The street seemed to loop endlessly, bringing them past the same diner and gas station again and again. The mannequins appeared to have shifted slightly each time, their positions and poses subtly altered. The most chilling moment came when they stopped at an intersection, trying to recalibrate their GPS. In the dim glow of the headlights, one of the mannequins, a little boy with a toy plane, turned its head ever so slightly toward the car. Panic set in. Lost in Lights slammed on the gas, speeding down the road in a blind attempt to escape. The streetlights began to flicker as they passed, and the town's pristine facade started to crack. Literal cracks spiderwebbed across windows, and the houses seemed to sag as though aging decades in seconds. Finally, they broke free of the town, the open road stretching out before them. Looking back in the rearview mirror, there was no sign of Barlow. No lights, no buildings, nothing but an empty stretch of trees. When they finally reached a populated area, they tried searching for the town online, but there were no records of a place called Barlow anywhere. Maps showed only an expanse of forest where the town should have been. The Reddit thread erupted with responses, with users theorizing everything from a government experiment to a time loop, or even an alternate dimension. Others shared similar experiences of encountering places that weren't supposed to exist. A user named Through the Glass commented, "I've heard of this. They say some towns aren't meant to be found. If you ever stumble upon one, don't stay long. They don't like visitors." What made the story especially haunting was Lost in Light's final remark. "I'm not even sure I ever left. Sometimes, when I'm driving at night, I swear I see those mannequins in the distance, standing at the edge of the woods, waiting." The story of the forgotten town remains one of Reddit's most enduring mysteries, a chilling reminder that some shortcuts aren't worth taking. It blurs the line between fiction and reality, preying on our fear of isolation and the unknown, and leaves an unsettling question lingering in the minds of all who hear it. What happens if the town finds its way back to you? Story 5. The Anonymous Caller. It started with a simple phone call. One of those late-night moments when the world outside seems quieter, as if the night itself is holding its breath. The Redditor, going by Unknown Caller, recalled how they'd been sitting in their dimly lit living room, scrolling through their phone when their own phone rang. At first, it was a random number. No name, no history, just an unfamiliar area code. The kind of call you'd usually ignore. But something about it felt different. There was an urgency in the air, almost like the call was meant for them. They picked up, and what they heard on the other end chilled them to the bone. "Your mother's favorite vase is about to break. No introduction, no greeting." Just that sentence, spoken in a flat, almost bored tone. Unknown Caller froze. The vase they kept in the living room was a gift from their late grandmother. It had never once been damaged, not even during the chaotic moments of family gatherings or pet accidents. It was more than just an object. It held sentimental value that Unknown Caller wasn't willing to risk. Thinking it was some kind of prank, they hung up, dismissing the call as a coincidence. But when they walked into the living room moments later, they froze. The vase was on the floor, shattered into pieces. That was only the beginning. Over the following weeks, the calls came almost nightly, each one more unsettling than the last. The caller's voice remained eerily monotone, and the messages, while cryptic, always seemed to have a peculiar relevance to their life. The next night, the caller told them, "You'll get a call from your old friend Jane tomorrow. She's moving away." Unknown Caller had lost contact with Jane years ago, but had recently reconnected on social media. Despite their initial excitement, they had barely talked since. The next afternoon, their phone rang again, but this time it was Jane on the line. "Hey, I didn't know how to say this, but I'm moving across the country. Just wanted to let you know before I left." The pattern continued. Each call was followed by an event in their life that seemed to have been predicted with unnerving precision. "Your car will break down on the freeway in 2 days." Unknown Caller had no reason to doubt the warning. Their car had been making strange noises for days. Sure enough, 2 days later, they found themselves stranded on the side of the road, engine smoking. And yet, it wasn't just these predictions that made the calls so terrifying. The caller also seemed to know secrets they hadn't shared with anyone, things that felt too personal for any stranger to know. One evening, the voice on the other end simply said, "You're still haunted by what happened in high school. You haven't forgiven yourself for not stopping it." Unknown caller's blood ran cold. The memory flooded back. The bullying they had witnessed but never intervened in. The classmate who had suffered because of it, and how guilt still gnawed at them all these years later. They had never spoken about it to anyone, not even their closest friends. And yet, this anonymous voice knew. With each call, the anxiety and paranoia grew. Unknown caller found themselves looking over their shoulder constantly, unable to shake the feeling of being watched. The calls would always happen at night, often after something significant had occurred in their life. A moment of joy, a difficult decision. They were always followed by an unsettling phone call, as if the caller were feeding off their emotional state. "Tomorrow, you'll make a decision that will change everything. You won't be able to take it back." They started feeling as if their life was no longer in their control. The feeling of helplessness began to gnaw at them. With every call, they were left questioning, how much did this person know? And why did they seem to be guiding unknown caller towards something they couldn't even anticipate? The fear escalated when the caller began predicting things with an almost supernatural accuracy. On one particularly cold night, the voice on the phone whispered, "Tonight, you'll find an old letter in your drawer. It's from your father. He never wanted you to see it, but you will. You'll wish you had." Unknown caller had completely forgotten about the letter, buried deep in a drawer they hadn't opened in years. The memory of it came rushing back. A letter their father had written but never sent. A letter with a confession that still haunted their thoughts. Unknown caller had never read it, convinced that the contents would be too painful to confront. But as soon as they heard the words, they knew what they had to do. They opened the drawer, the paper crinkling under their fingers, and there it was. The letter, untouched for years, just as the caller had described. The letter contained a truth that unknown caller wasn't prepared to hear. It was a confession from their father, admitting to a past mistake that had shaped their entire family's life. The revelation tore open old wounds that had long since healed over. But what was more terrifying was that the anonymous caller knew about it, as if they had orchestrated the events leading to the letter's discovery. At this point, unknown caller was living in a constant state of paranoia. They couldn't escape the feeling that their every move was being anticipated, manipulated. The tension reached a breaking point when the caller made one final prediction. "Tonight, when you go to bed, the last call will be the one that changes everything. You'll finally learn who I am." Unknown caller stayed awake all night, terrified of what was coming. The phone never rang, and yet, in the silence of that night, the weight of what they'd endured began to settle in. Had they been living under the influence of someone they would never see? Someone who knew more about their life than even they did? Were they part of a larger game they didn't understand? The final call never came, but the calls themselves continued, echoing in the corners of unknown caller's mind. They still wonder, sometimes late at night, if the calls will ever stop, if the person on the other end will ever reveal themselves, or if perhaps they've been a part of something far more sinister than they could ever comprehend. Analysis. What makes these stories so terrifying? In the world of horror, some stories rise above others, becoming legendary in their own right. The stories shared on Reddit, the ones that blur the lines between fiction and reality, often become more than just simple tales of terror. They evolve into iconic creepypastas, perpetuated by the users themselves and made unforgettable by their haunting truths. But what is it that makes these particular Reddit stories so chilling, so universally terrifying? The answer lies in their construction, the psychological depth they reach, and the way they engage readers, turning them from passive consumers of horror into active participants in a growing nightmare. One of the core aspects that makes these Reddit stories so terrifying is their use of relatable settings. Unlike many traditional ghost stories or urban legends, which rely on distant, fantastical settings, the best creepypasta tales are grounded in the very real spaces people know. Homes, mirrors, and even towns that sound familiar become the perfect backdrops for fear. After all, there's nothing more unsettling than having something terrifying occur in a place where you should feel safe. Take the Whispering Walls, for example. The haunted house isn't some decrepit mansion far off in the woods, but an abandoned building that could be just down the street. The Vanishing Friend takes place in the wilderness, a setting anyone could recognize, but the eerie disappearance makes you question the very places you consider secure. These are spaces we interact with daily, and the idea that something could be lurking within them, something unexplainable, is the foundation of these stories' terror. Equally important is the clever use of ambiguity. In these stories, the unknown plays a central role, often leaving much of the horror in the hands of the readers themselves. It's not just what the protagonist experiences that frightens us, but what could happen. This is especially evident in stories like The Shadow and the Mirror, where the phenomenon of the mirror could be a supernatural entity, a psychological breakdown, or something far darker. The story never quite clarifies what the shadow is or why it exists, leaving readers to fill in the gaps with their own darkest imaginings. The horror isn't spelled out, it's implied, suggested, and most importantly, left open-ended. User engagement is another key element in turning these Reddit stories into legendary creepypastas. The comment sections of these posts often become a breeding ground for collective horror, where readers not only discuss the story, but add their own theories, experiences, and sometimes even weave new chapters into the narrative. A story like The Whispering Walls isn't just shaped by the original poster. It's shaped by the thousands of Reddit users who interact with it, sharing their own encounters with haunted spaces or whispering voices, all contributing to the mythology surrounding the tale. The comment section becomes as much a part of the story as the post itself, and in some cases, the story wouldn't be the same without these contributions. These stories are not isolated, finished products. They are evolving, living entities that grow with each comment, each theory, each new interpretation. But it's not just about what readers add. It's the psychological and emotional impact that these stories leave behind. When you finish reading one of these Reddit creepypastas, it's not the plot itself that keeps you awake at night. It's the what-ifs. The uncertainty lingers. The small details, the hints that suggest something darker, remain embedded in your mind, forcing you to imagine all the possibilities, the scenarios that could have been left unsaid. That's what keeps you up long after the story ends. It's the fear of the unknown, of not knowing what's real and what's imagined. The stories tap into primal fears. The fear of being watched, the fear of isolation, the fear of the unseen. In The Vanishing Friend, the dread isn't just the disappearance, but the fear that maybe, just maybe, it could happen to you or someone you love. In The Shadow and the Mirror, the terror is the loss of control, the fear of being unable to trust what you see. The subtle emotional impact, the psychological tension of these stories, lingers far beyond their final sentences, leaving you to wonder about your own mirrors, your own dark corners of the world, your own phone calls in the middle of the night. Ultimately, what makes these Reddit creepypastas so effective is the perfect combination of fear and engagement. The familiarity of the settings, the haunting ambiguity, the ever-growing user involvement, and the deeply unsettling emotional impact all come together to create stories that don't just scare us, they stick with us. We aren't just frightened by the events. We're scared of the questions they raise, the possibilities they present, and the lingering fear that the horror might not be confined to the page, but could be waiting for us the next time we turn off the lights. The greatest horror stories aren't about what's visible. They're about what might be. And it's this ambiguity, this gap between reality and fiction, that makes these Reddit nightmares so unforgettable. As we journeyed through these 5 spine-chilling stories from Reddit, a common thread emerges: the terrifying feeling that reality itself can fracture in the most unsettling ways. Each tale, whether it was the whispers in the walls of an abandoned house, the eerie vanishing of a friend on a camping trip, the shadow that didn't mimic its owner, the forgotten town that seemed to exist outside of time, or the anonymous caller who seemed to know secrets no one else could. leaves us questioning the very fabric of the world around us. The stories linger long after they've been told, etching a sense of dread that seems to creep into the corners of our minds. You may find yourself glancing at your own mirrors more carefully, checking the doors of your house to make sure they're locked, or perhaps even picking up the phone and hesitating before answering an unknown number. This is the true nature of these stories, the ability to make the line between fiction and reality blur, and in doing so, instill a haunting sense of unease that lingers far longer than the last sentence. The real terror lies not in what has been shared, but in what could happen next, and more importantly, what might already be happening. So, here's the question that should stay with you long after this video ends. What if one of these nightmares is already happening to you? What if you are the one hearing whispers in the night? Or worse, what if the next time you pick up the phone, it's a voice you've never heard, telling you things you never thought anyone could know? It's this kind of haunting ambiguity that is at the core of what makes these stories so chilling. Now, it's your turn. Have you ever experienced something you couldn't explain? Or perhaps you've encountered a strange story of your own, one that defies logic, one that makes you wonder if there's more to this world than meets the eye. Share your experiences in the comments below, and let's keep the conversation going. Who knows? Maybe your story will inspire the next nightmare that makes us all shiver in the dark. And if you want more stories that will keep you up all night, don't forget to subscribe. But be warned, once you're part of this community of the strange and the unsettling, there's no turning back. So, subscribe if you dare, but don't say we didn't warn you. The shadows are always waiting for their next visitor.